The heat out here doesn't just burn your skin, it cooks your lungs. Every breath tastes like copper and dry dust. I had been tracking the herd for 3 days across the scorched remains of Nevada, waiting for them to drift south so I could scavenge what was left of the highway outpost. But the wind shifted. It always shifts when you get complacent. Suddenly, that familiar, sickly sweet scent of rotting meat hit me before the sound did. The shuffling. The wet, slapping sound of feet dragging over asphalt. I needed cover, and I needed it 5 minutes ago. I scrambled up a scree slope, my boots sliding on loose shale, desperate to put jagged terrain between me and the infected. That's when I saw it. Not a cave, but a geometric angle jutting out of the sand that nature doesn't make. It was steel. Reinforced, rusted, and half-buried, but definitely man-made. I wasn't looking for a miracle, I was just looking for a hole to die in, but what I found was something else entirely. I slid down the backside of the dune, the tactical radio on my shoulder digging into my collarbone. I held my breath, listening. The herd was moving past the ridge, their groans carried away by the desert wind. I turned my attention to the metal slab. It was a blast door, heavy industrial grade, painted a fading warning yellow beneath decades of grime. There was a manual override wheel, recessed into the heavy steel. My gloves gripped the iron, hot enough to blister skin even through the leather. It wouldn't budge. I braced my boot against the frame, gritting my teeth, and heaved. The screech of metal grinding against metal echoed like a gunshot in the silence of the desert. I froze, rifle raised, waiting for the scream of a runner. Nothing. Just the wind. I squeezed through the gap before the hydraulics could fill completely, and let the door slam shut behind me. The silence inside was absolute. It was cooler here, damp and smelling of stagnant water and ozone. I clicked on my shoulder light. The beam cut through the dust motes, revealing a long concrete stairwell descending into the throat of the earth. This wasn't a storm cellar. This was military. Deep earth confinement. I checked the Geiger counter on my vest. Background radiation was normal. Whatever killed this place, it wasn't the bombs. I moved slowly, keeping my weight on the balls of my feet to dampen the sound of my boots. Every step down took me further from the sun and deeper into a tomb. At the bottom of the stairs, a heavy bulkhead door stood ajar. The airlock. I stepped through, sweeping the corner with my rifle. The corridor beyond was vast, lined with conduits and piping that ran along the ceiling like the arteries of a dead giant. Emergency lights flickered in a rhythmic, hypnotic red pulse, casting long, dancing shadows that looked too much like movement. My heart was hammering against my ribs. Bunkers like this were supposed to be the safe zones. They were supposed to be the arcs that carried humanity through the fire. But the scorch marks on the walls told a different story. Small arms fire. Panic. This place hadn't fallen to the radiation outside, it had rotted from the inside. I pressed forward, the rubber soles of my boots squeaking softly on the linoleum. I passed rooms labeled with alphanumeric codes. Storage A1. Generator access. Filtration. I tried the handle of a door marked medical. Locked. I pulled my pry tool from my vest, wedging it into the jamb. With a sharp crack, the lock gave way. The smell hit me instantly, antiseptic masking the underlying stench of decay. The room was a wreck. Gurneys overturned, glass cabinets shattered, medical files strewn across the floor like confetti. But the shelves, my God, the shelves. Antibiotics. Bandages. Morphine. Enough supplies to keep a squad alive for years. My hand shook as I reached for a box of sterile gauze. In this new world, this was worth more than gold. This was life. I was stuffing my pack, greed overriding my tactical sense, when I heard it. A click. Not a mechanical click, but the wet, clicking sound of a tongue against a hard palate. I froze, the blood draining from my face. It came from the hallway. I killed my light, plunging the room into darkness, illuminated only by the rhythmic red flash from the corridor. I pressed my back against the overturned gurney, raising my silenced rifle. The footsteps were different here. Heavier. Purposeful. This wasn't a mindless shambler. This was something else. Through the crack in the door, I saw a shadow detach itself from the gloom. It was wearing tatters of what looked like a lab coat over military fatigues. It stopped right outside the medical bay. I held my breath until my lungs burned. The thing turned its head, and in the red strobe of the emergency light, I saw its face. Or what was left of it. Fungal plates had erupted from the jaw, fusing the mouth open in a permanent, silent scream. It was blind, clicking its tongue to echolocate. A clicker. We used to think they were myths, campfire stories told by people who had ventured into the cities. But here it was, standing 10 feet from me. I knew I couldn't shoot it. If I missed the brain stem, it would scream, and in a bunker like this, sound travels forever. I had to let it pass. It took a step into the room, its head twitching side to side. It sniffed the air, smelling the fresh sweat of my fear. My finger hovered over the trigger. It was so close I could hear the wet gurgle of its breathing. Then, distantly, the sound of the bunker's settling ventilation system groaned. The creature snapped its head toward the noise in the hallway and hissed, backing out of the room to investigate the sound. I waited 10 seconds, 20, counting the heartbeats thudding in my ears. I slipped out of the room, moving in the opposite direction, deeper into the facility. I found the command center at the end of the hall. The heavy blast doors were open. Inside, banks of monitors sat dead and black, except for one. A single terminal glowing with green text. I approached it, wiping the dust from the screen. It was a log entry, dated 3 years ago. The cursor was still blinking. I sat in the chair, the leather cracking under my weight, and began to read. Project Chimera has failed. Containment breach in Sector 4. The inhibitor doesn't work. It accelerates the growth. God help us, we made them faster. A chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning ran down my spine. This wasn't a shelter. It was a lab. They weren't hiding from the virus. They were trying to weaponize it. I looked at the map on the wall. Sector 4 was below me. And the only way out of the bunker was through the ventilation shafts that connected to the lower levels. I checked my magazine. 20 rounds. one grenade, and a combat knife. I stood up, adjusting the straps of my vest. I hadn't found a sanctuary. I had walked into a slaughterhouse. But the only way out was through. I racked the slide on my rifle, the sound sharp and final. Time to go to work. The heavy steel wheel of the airlock groaned under my grip, a screech of rusted metal that echoed like a dying scream across the silent desert floor. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic rhythm warring with the slow, oppressive silence of the ruins behind me. I paused, listening. The wind howled through the skeletal remains of the skyscrapers above, but down here, in the shadow of the blast doors, there was only the sound of my own ragged breathing and the shifting of sand against my boots. I put my weight into it, gritting my teeth, and with a thunderous clank, the locking mechanism disengaged. The door swung inward, exhaling a breath of stale, pressurized air that smelled of ozone, copper, and ancient rot. I stepped into the abyss, the beam of my tactical light cutting a cone of clarity through the suffocating gloom. The air was cooler here, a sharp drop from the blistering desert heat that had been cooking me alive for weeks. I swept the light left then right. Concrete walls, thick and reinforced, lined with conduits and pipes labeled in fading yellow paint. This wasn't just a storm cellar. This was a military-grade installation, buried deep enough to survive the apocalypse, but evidently not deep enough to survive the silence that followed. I drew my sidearm, the weight of the P226 familiar and comforting, though I only had 11 rounds left. Scavenging down here was a gamble, high risk, high reward. If the ventilation scrubbers had failed early, I might be walking into a tomb of asphyxiated corpses. If they hadn't, well, I preferred the dead to stay dead. The first room was a decontamination chamber. Hazmat suits hung limp on the walls like shed skins, their orange rubber cracked and peeling. I checked the pockets of the nearest one, empty, save for a crumbled wrapper of a protein bar that expired 3 years ago. I moved deeper, stepping over a barrier of overturned benches. The floor was littered with debris, clipboards, shattered glass, and spent shell casings. 56 millimeters. Someone had fought here. I crouched, running a gloved finger over the brass. It was tarnished dark with age. The battle for this bunker had ended a long time ago. I moved toward the security checkpoint, stepping over the skeletal remains of a guard. The uniform was tattered, the bones picked clean by time and insects, but the holster was empty. Someone had looted the weapon, but they'd missed the magazine pouch on the belt. I snagged 2 magazines, wiping the dust off the feed lips. Standard capacity. A godsend. Beyond the checkpoint, the facility opened up into a central hub. The layout was standard for subterranean command, mess hall to the left, barracks to the right, labs and command center deeper in. I chose the labs. Food was critical, but knowledge was power, and lately, the infection had been changing. I needed to know if they knew why. The corridor to the research wing was dark, the emergency lights long dead. My footsteps sounded impossibly loud on the linoleum. I kept my weapon raised, checking corners. The smell of rot grew stronger here, not the dry decay of the desert, but something sweeter, wetter. Something fungal. I pushed through the double doors of the main laboratory. The space was a chaos of smashed equipment and scattered papers. Centrifuges lay on their sides, shattered glass crunching under my boots. But it was the containment units along the back wall that froze the blood in my veins. They were cylindrical glass tanks, most broken, but one was intact. Inside, floating in a murky, yellowed preservation fluid, was a severed head. But it wasn't like the shambles I'd dealt with in the cities. The skin was calcified, hardened into a gray, chitinous armor. Spikes of bone protruded from the jawline and the brow ridges. The eyes were gone, replaced by sensory pits. I moved closer, wiping the condensation from the glass. A plaque beneath it read, Specimen 14 Post-arid Adaptation Phase 3. I quickly began rifling through the desks, looking for the logs. I found a leather-bound journal in a drawer, the handwriting erratic. I scanned the final entries. The heat is accelerating the mutation. The ink read. The pathogen realizes the host cannot survive the dehydration of the surface. It is rewriting the DNA to conserve moisture. It is turning them into stones that walk. They don't bleed anymore. You have to break them. I swallowed hard. The zombies on the surface were slow, dried-out husks. But down here, where there was moisture? Or worse, if these things were the result of the virus adapting to the environment, what happened when they had time to perfect the design? I stuffed the journal into my pack and turned to the supply cabinets. Locked. I used the butt of my pistol to shatter the glass, the noise ringing out like a dinner bell. I didn't care. I grabbed antibiotics, sealed bandages, and a box of sterile syringes. Gold dust. Then I saw it, a heavy, reinforced case labeled Viral Suppressant Experimental. My hand shook as I reached for it. If this was real, it was worth more than water. It was hope. I grabbed the case, the weight substantial, and swung my pack back over my shoulder. That was when I heard it. A clicking sound. Like two stones being struck together, rhythmic and wet. It was coming from the ventilation duct above me. I spun around, raising my light. The grate was missing. Darkness stared back at me. Then the clicking stopped, replaced by a low, vibrating hiss. I backed away toward the door, my heart hammering against my ribs. Phase 3. I whispered to myself. Stones that walk. Something dropped from the ceiling behind me. It hit the floor with the weight of an anvil, cracking the tile. I spun, firing blindly. The muzzle flash illuminated a nightmare. It was humanoid, but only just. The creature was encased in plates of gray, bone-like armor. It had no eyes, just a row of heat-sensing pits along a snout that looked more insect than human. My bullet sparked off its chest, ricocheting harmlessly. It didn't flinch. It lunged. I dove to the right, crashing into a lab bench. The creature smashed through the table where I had been standing, wood and metal splintering like balsa. It was fast, terrifyingly fast for something that looked so heavy. I scrambled back, my boots slipping on the slick floor. I needed to break it. The journal said break them. I aimed for the joints, the spaces between the armor plates. I fired twice at its knee. A spray of black, viscous fluid erupted, and the creature shrieked, a sound like grinding metal. It stumbled, one leg buckling. I didn't wait. I scrambled over the debris, heading for the door. The creature roared, a guttural sound that vibrated in my chest, and I heard the scrabble of its claws on the floor as it pursued. I burst into the hallway, sprinting toward the exit. I could hear it behind me, heavy footsteps thudding against the concrete. I needed a choke point. The security checkpoint. If I could get through the turnstile and jam it. I vaulted over the desk, my breath tearing at my throat. I spun around, grabbing a heavy metal chair and jamming it into the mechanism of the blast door just as the creature slammed into it. The metal groaned, bending under the force, but it held. The creature clawed at the reinforced glass of the viewing window, its mandibles clicking furiously. I shined my light on it one last time. The armor was thick, almost prehistoric. The infection wasn't just reanimating the dead anymore. It was evolving them into apex predators for a dead world. I turned and ran for the airlock, the adrenaline souring in my veins. I had the medicine. I had the ammo. But I also had the truth. The desert wasn't empty. It was an incubator. And what was growing down here was getting ready to hatch. I sealed the outer door behind me, the hydraulic hiss cutting off the creature's screams, and stepped back out into the blinding, silent heat of the wasteland. I checked my magazine. 3 rounds left. I looked at the horizon, shimmering in the heat haze. We had thought the worst was over when the bombs stopped falling. We were wrong. The war was just beginning. The wheel of the airlock door was cold against my blistered palms. A circle of freezing steel that felt alien after months of touching nothing but scorching sand and sun-baked ruins. With a groan of rusted hinges that echoed like a dying scream across the desert floor, the seal broke. A hiss of escaping pressure, stale, recycled air trapped since the world ended, blasted past me, carrying the metallic taste of ozone and the heavy, sweet scent of decay. I didn't hesitate. I slipped through the gap before the hydraulic dampeners could seize, pulling the heavy door shut behind me. The searing white heat of the wasteland was instantly replaced by a suffocating, absolute darkness. I clicked my flashlight on. The beam cut a cone through dust motes that had been suspended in silence for years. I was in a decontamination antechamber. Yellow hazard suits hung limp on hooks like shed skins of giant insects. I bypassed them. My filtration mask was already taped tight to my face, the rubber chafing my jaw. I checked the Geiger counter clipped to my belt. The needle barely twitched. No radiation. That meant this wasn't a fallout shelter. It was something else. A containment site. The inner door required a keycard, but time had done the work for me. The electronic mag lock had failed when the backup batteries died, leaving the door slightly ajar. I pried it open with the crowbar, the screech of metal on metal sounding like a dinner bell in a graveyard. I froze, listening. The silence that followed was heavy, pressurized. No shambling footsteps. No groans. Just the rhythmic dripping of condensation somewhere deep in the belly of the complex. I moved into the main corridor. The scavenging instinct took over, suppressing the fear. My eyes scanned for resources, filtering out the debris of panic, overturned gurneys, scattered papers, smashed monitors. I found the first prize in a security station, a half-empty tactical rig. I stripped the dead guard, ignoring the way his dried skin crackled like parchment. I salvaged 3 magazines of 5.56 ammunition, a combat knife with a serrated spine, and a heavy-duty radio that was likely dead but worth the parts. But it was the next room that made my heart hammer against my ribs. Storage. Shelf after shelf of industrial shelving. Much of it had been looted or tipped over, but the back corner was untouched. I ran my fingers over the cold aluminum of canned goods. Peaches. Beef stew. A crate of water purification tablets. This was gold. This was life. I began shoving cans into my pack, the weight of them reassuring. I was greedy, moving too fast, the clatter of tin cans loud in the oppressive quiet. I stopped, forcing myself to breathe. Survival rule number 1: don't get heavy. Speed is life. I took only what I could carry without compromising my agility, leaving the rest. It hurt to leave it, but being a slow-moving mule in a dark hole was a death sentence. I pushed deeper, seeking the generator room. If I could get the air scrubbers working, this place could be a base. The corridor sloped downward, the air growing colder, damper. The walls here were different. Scratched. Deeply gouged. Not by tools, but by claws. Or bone. The marks were high up, near the ceiling vents. I entered a laboratory sector. The glass observation windows were smeared with dried black ichor. I swept the light over a desk and found a chaotic scatter of clipboards. I picked one up, wiping away the grime. The log dates were from 3 years ago, 6 months after the initial outbreak. They had survived longer than most. The handwriting became erratic near the end. Subject 82 shows adaptation to low-light environments. Epidermal hardening. Bioluminescent trace in the ocular cavities. The virus isn't just reanimating, it's optimizing. It's rewriting the DNA to hunt. My grip tightened on the crowbar. Optimizing. We had always assumed the Zulus were rotting, degrading over time. But down here, shielded from the UV radiation that cooked them on the surface, they weren't rotting. They were fermenting. Changing. I found the generator room at the bottom of the spiral stairs. The air was thick here, smelling of copper and wet earth. A massive diesel turbine sat silent in the center. I moved to the fuel intake, checking the gauge. Surprisingly, it was half full. The lockdown must have severed the fuel line feed to prevent a fire, saving the supply. I primed the pump, the manual lever offering stiff resistance. That's when I heard it. Not a groan. A click. It came from the shadows above the turbine. A wet, clicking sound, like tongue against teeth, followed by the scrape of something hard against concrete. I swung the flashlight up. The beam hit the ceiling, and for a second, my brain refused to process the image. It was clinging to the pipes, upside down. It used to be human, wearing the tattered remains of a lab coat, but the physiology had been warped. The skin was gone, replaced by a gray, callous hide that looked like wet stone. Its limbs were elongated, the joints swollen and reversed, allowing it to grip the infrastructure like a spider. But it was the face that froze my blood. There were no eyes. Just smooth, gray flesh where the sockets should be. The virus had sealed them shut. Instead, the ears were flared bat-like, and long, translucent tendrils of fungus sprouted from its jaw, twitching in the air currents. It was blind. It was hunting by sound. I had stopped breathing. The clicking sound came from its throat, echolocation. It turned its head, the tendrils vibrating as they picked up the disturbance I had made priming the pump. It dropped. It didn't fall clumsily like the shamblers up top. It landed in a crouch, silent and fluid, absorbing the impact. It was 10 feet away. I slowly reached for the pistol on my hip, the leather holster creaking microscopically. The creature screamed, a high-pitched, resonant shriek that slammed into me like a physical blow, and lunged. I threw myself to the right, crashing into a tool cart. The creature smashed into the spot where I had been standing, its claws gouging sparks from the metal grating. It was fast, terrifyingly fast. I scrambled back, raising the gun. Asterisk bang. Bang. Asterisk. The muzzle flushes illuminated the room in strobe light horror. The bullets hit, but they didn't penetrate. They sparked off the gray hide. The creature had calcified armor plates over its vital organs. The evolution the notes spoke of, it was a tank. It whipped around, the gunshot echoes confusing its sonar. It slashed blindly, a long, bone-spur claw shearing through the heavy rubber of a coolant pipe next to me. Steam blasted out with a deafening hiss. The creature recoiled, shrieking again, thrashing at the hot steam. It was sensitive to heat. The surface killed them, so they adapted to the cold dark. Heat was their weakness. I didn't have a flamethrower. I had a road flare in my scavenger pouch. My hands shook violently as I ripped the pouch open. The creature was recovering, orienting itself through the noise of the steam. It turned toward me, its eyeless face tilting. It could hear my heart beating. It coiled its legs to spring. I struck the flare. Red light exploded in the room, blindingly bright in the pitch black. The chemical hiss was loud, but the heat was intense. The creature flinched, retreating into the shadows of the turbine. I didn't wait. I threw the sputtering red flare directly at the pool of diesel that had leaked from the prime pump. Asterisk whoosh. Asterisk. A wall of fire erupted between us. The creature screeched, a sound of pure alien rage, as the flames licked at its sensitive skin. It scurried backward, up the wall, retreating into the vents with a clatter of limbs. I didn't stay to see if it would come back. The fire alarm finally triggered, a low, thrumming klaxon that vibrated the floor. I sprinted for the stairs, the weight of the canned food slamming against my back. I vaulted the steps 2 at a time, lungs burning, fueled by adrenaline. I made it to the airlock, throwing myself against the wheel. I spun it, the gears grinding. Behind me, in the dark corridor, I heard them. Not just one. Dozens. The clicking. The hive had woken up. I shoved the door open and tumbled out into the desert ruins. The sun was setting, painting the sky in bruises of purple and orange. The heat hit me like a hammer, but I welcomed it. I collapsed in the sand, gasping, staring at the heavy steel door of the bunker. I had food. I had ammo. But I had lost the hope of a sanctuary. The bunker wasn't empty. It was an incubator. The infection up here was just the first draft. Down there, in the dark, nature was writing the sequel, and it was efficient, armored, and intelligent. I pushed myself up, dusting the sand from my knees. I looked at the seal on the door. It held. For now. I marked the location on my map with a heavy black X and wrote a single word next to it, evolved. Then I turned south, toward the fading light, walking away from the treasure trove of food. Knowing that starving in the desert was better than whatever was waiting to hatch in the dark. The iron wheel of the airlock was hot enough to blister skin, radiating the brutal, relentless thermal energy of the desert sun that beat down on the ruins above. My gloves, ragged and stained with the black ichor of the dead, offered just enough protection as I leaned my entire body weight against the mechanism. It groaned, a deep, tectonic screech of metal shearing against rust that had settled over a decade of silence. For a moment, I thought it was fused shut, another tomb sealed by time, but then the seal broke. A hiss of escaping pressure, not air rushing in, but stale, pressurized air rushing out, kicked up a cloud of red sand around my boots. The smell hit me instantly. It wasn't the rot of the surface, the sweet, cloying scent of decomposing flesh that wafted through the cities. This was the smell of old copper, ozone, and chemical desiccant. I clicked my flashlight on, the beam cutting a stark white cone through the gloom, and stepped out of the blinding desert glare into the throat of the earth. The bunker was darker than night, the kind of heavy, suffocating darkness that feels like a physical weight. I swept the light across the walls of the decontamination antechamber. Tyvek suits hung on hooks like shed skins, some of them torn, others pristine. On the floor, a Geiger counter lay smashed, its needle frozen in the red zone. I checked my own dosimeter. It clicked rhythmically, but stayed within safe limits. The radiation outside had settled into the soil, but down here, shielded by 10 feet of lead and concrete, the air was clean, toxic in other ways. Perhaps, but not radioactive. I moved to the inner door, bypassing the biometric scanner that had long since lost power, and used the manual override lever. It yielded easier than the outer door, sliding into the wall with a heavy thud. This was the jackpot. The layout painted on the wall indicated a 3-level facility: command, habitation, and research. I needed habitation first. My canteen was light, sloshing with the last dregs of warm, dirty water I'd filtered from a radiator 2 days ago. I moved silently, my boots wrapping in rags to dampen the sound of my footsteps on the metal grating. Silence was the only armor that mattered anymore. The infected on the surface relied on sound and smell, but down here? I didn't know what lived down here. The mess hall was a mausoleum of interrupted lives. Trays were still on the tables, mummified food fused to plastic plates. But along the back wall, the pantry door stood ajar. My heart hammered against my ribs, a mix of anticipation and fear. I slipped inside, sweeping the light over metal shelving. Picked over, but not empty. Whoever had fled, or died, here hadn't taken everything. I found a crate of MREs, the brown plastic packaging covered in dust but intact. Beef brisket. Jalapeno cheese spread. I tore one open immediately, shoveling the dry crackers into my mouth, the taste of stale salt the best thing I'd ever experienced. I shoved 6 packs into my rucksack. Then the water. A pallet of emergency purified water pouches. I drank 3 in rapid succession, feeling my dehydrated cells sing as the fluid hit my system. I filled every empty container I had. This scavenge alone was worth the risk of the ruins, but I pushed greed aside. Grab the essentials. Keep moving. Ammo. I needed ammo. I bypassed the barracks. Sleeping quarters usually meant bodies. And bodies meant variables I didn't want to deal with yet, and headed for the armory near the security checkpoint. The cage was locked, heavy chain-link wire. Inside, racks of rifles stood like silent sentinels. I didn't have the tools to cut the heavy padlock, but the desk officer's station was unsecured. I rifled through the drawers. No keys, but a box of loose 9mm rounds rolled to the back. 50 rounds. Gold. I fed them into my empty magazines, the metallic click of the spring the only sound in the oppressive silence. Then I saw the logbook. It lay open on the desk, the pages curled from the dry air. The final entry wasn't scribbled in panic. It was written with terrifying, clinical precision. Day 412. The filtration system is failing. Heat levels in the lower labs are rising. Subject 14 shows signs of hyperadaptation. The necrosis has stopped. Calcification has begun. They aren't rotting anymore. They are hardening. I froze. The infection, the rot, as we called it up top, was a necrotic agent. It killed the host and piloted the corpse until the meat fell off the bone. But evolution is a reaction to pressure. In the desert, rot is inefficient. Moisture is scarce. The virus had adapted. I turned the page. Subject 14 breached containment at 0400 hours. Small arms fire ineffective. The dermal layer has transitioned into a keratin calcium compound. Aim for the joints or the eyes. Evacuation protocols initiated. The date on the entry was 6 years ago. I needed to leave. I had water, I had food, I had ammo. I turned back toward the corridor, my beams swinging wild. That's when I heard it. It wasn't the wet, gurgling moan of a surface zombie. It was a dry, rhythmic clicking, like 2 stones being struck together. Click-clack. Click-clack. It was coming from the stairwell leading down to the research level. Logic screamed at me to run, but curiosity, the fatal flaw of every survivor, tethered me for a second too long. I aimed the light down the stairwell. At the bottom of the flight, something stood looking up at me. It was humanoid, but stripped of all humanity. It had no lips, no nose, just a flat, nasal slit in a skull that looked like it had been dipped in concrete. Its skin was a mosaic of gray, cracked plates, like a dried riverbed. It didn't have eyes, just dark, sunken pits protected by ridges of bone. It was naked, but the armor covering its body made it look clothed in stone. The light hit it, and it hissed, a sound like sand pouring over dry leaves. It didn't shamble. It bolted. The speed was impossible. It cleared the first flight of stairs in 2 bounds, moving on all fours like a spider, its limbs locking and unlocking with mechanical precision. I raised my pistol and fired. The shot deafened me in the enclosed space. The bullet sparked off the creature's chest, chipping the gray armor but failing to penetrate. It didn't even slow down. "Joints," the log had said. "Aim for the joints." I backed up, knocking over a chair, creating an obstacle. The thing vaulted it, its claws, fingers fused into hook spikes, scrabbling for purchase on the tile. I lined up my sights on its knee as it landed. I fired twice. The first round missed, shattering the floor tile. The second connected. A puff of white dust erupted from its leg, and the limb buckled backward with a sickening crack. The creature screeched, a high-frequency sound that made my teeth ache, and collapsed sideways. But it didn't stop. It began to drag itself forward with terrifying upper body strength, the clicking of its claws on the floor accelerating. I sprinted for the airlock. The hallway seemed to stretch for miles. I could hear the scraping of the thing behind me, the dry rasp of its breathing. I reached the antechamber and slammed the inner door, spinning the wheel. I risked a glance through the thick reinforced glass of the viewport. The creature slammed into the door, its face pressing against the glass. Up close, the horror was absolute. The virus had consumed all the fluids in its body, repurposing the minerals to build an exoskeleton to survive the heat. It was a biological tank. It hammered on the glass, the impact vibrating through the steel frame. Spiderweb cracks began to form in the center of the viewport. I scrambled for the outer release. The hydraulics whined, too slow, agonizingly slow. The glass behind me groaned under another impact. I squeezed through the opening gap of the outer door before it was fully open. Tumbling out into the blinding white heat of the desert afternoon. I spun around and jammed the crowbar I'd used earlier into the external wheel, locking it in place. Inside, I could hear the muffled thuds of the thing trying to break through the inner seal. It wouldn't hold forever. I grabbed my pack, the water sloshing, a sound that felt dangerously loud now. I looked out at the ruins of the city shimmering in the heat haze. We thought the heat was our ally, that it baked the rot out of the dead, making them slow and fragile. We were wrong. The bunker proved it. The infection wasn't dying. It was armoring up. It was preparing for the long haul. I checked the magazine of my pistol. 43 rounds left. I took a sip of the scavenged water, the plastic warm against my lips, and started walking. I had to get back to the colony. I had to tell them. The winter of the dead was over. The age of the stone ones had begun. The wheel of the blast door was hot enough to blister my skin through the leather gloves. A searing reminder of the desert's sun beating down on the ruins above. It groaned as I applied my weight, a tectonic grinding of rusted gears that hadn't moved since the bombs fell, or perhaps since the outbreak began. With a final, agonizing screech, the locking mechanism disengaged. A hiss of equalizing pressure assaulted my ears, smelling of stale, recycled air and the metallic tang of ozone. I wasn't just opening a door, I was breaking the seal on a tomb. I pushed the heavy steel slab inward, the darkness beyond swallowing the beam of my tactical light like a physical substance. The transition from the blinding white heat of the desert afternoon to the subterranean chill was instant. Sweat turning cold on my neck as I stepped across the threshold. The airlock cycled automatically, powered by some dying reserve battery. The inner door sliding open to reveal a corridor bathed in the strobing red pulse of emergency lighting. This wasn't a civilian fallout shelter. The reinforced concrete walls, the floor-mounted guidance strips, and the distinct lack of creature comforts screamed military black site. My grip tightened on the foregrip of my carbine. Scavenging the surface had become a game of diminishing returns, pick over gas stations and sun-bleached corpses holding nothing but empty pockets. Down here, however, the silence suggested opportunity. I moved systematically, clearing the first sector room by room. The scavenging was rich, almost suspiciously so. In a storage locker labeled Quartermaster, I found the holy grail of the wasteland, pristine water filters. Sealed MRE crates that hadn't been gnawed through by rats, and boxes of 5.56 ammunition. I loaded my pack with methodical precision, prioritizing caloric density and lethality. But as I moved deeper, past the living quarters and into the operational wing, the narrative of the bunker shifted. There were no signs of panic. No barricades hastily erected from overturned tables. The personnel hadn't died fighting, they had died working. I found the first body in a hallway leading to Sector 4. It wasn't a shambler. It was slumped against the wall, dried out like cured leather, clutching a clipboard. I shone my light on the face, expecting the usual rictus of rot. Instead, I saw calcification. The skin hadn't decomposed. It had hardened into a gray, shell-like carapace. The eyes were gone, replaced by smooth, bone-like growths. I knelt, examining the clipboard. It was a medical log, the handwriting frantic. Subject 12 showing extreme epidermal resistance. Viral strain adapting to arid conditions. Solar radiation seems to accelerate the pupal stage. Pupal stage? The infection I knew turned people into meat-hungry drones. It didn't build armor. I stood up, the unease in my gut twisting into genuine fear. This wasn't just a survival bunker, it was a petri dish. I pushed into the laboratory complex, the heavy blast doors here left wide open. The air grew colder, and a new smell hit me. Not rot, but something earthy, like mushrooms and wet clay. The main lab was a cavernous room filled with smashed glass and overturned centrifuges. In the center stood a row of containment tubes. 3 were shattered from the inside out. 1 was intact. I approached it, wiping the condensation from the glass. Floating in the suspension fluid was a man, or what used to be a man. The evolution of the virus was laid bare. The subject's jaw had unhinged and fused, creating a wide, jagged maw designed for crushing bone rather than tearing flesh. Ridges of bone protruded from the shoulders and spine, natural armor plating. But the most terrifying detail was the sensory adaptation. The ears were gone, the nose flattened. Along the side of the head, gill-like slits pulsed rhythmically. I found a terminal nearby, the screen flickering with a low-power warning. I'd bypassed the security lockout. Whoever had been here last didn't care about encryption anymore. The final entry was dated 3 years ago. I read it, my breath hitching. The Alpha Desert strain has achieved homeostasis. It no longer requires a living host to maintain cellular cohesion. It consumes the host, calcifies the exterior to retain moisture, and enters a state of estivation during the day. We thought the heat would kill them. We were wrong. The heat forged them. They don't hunt by sight anymore. They hunt by vibration. They hunt by thermal signature. And they are pack hunters. A sound from the corridor behind me froze the blood in my veins. It wasn't a moan. It was a click, sharp, rhythmic, like 2 stones being struck together. Click. 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 I killed the flashlight instantly, plunging the lab into the red gloom of the emergency strobes. My heart hammered against my ribs, a drumbeat I prayed was too quiet to hear. The entry log flashed in my mind, thermal signature. I was a beacon of heat in a cold tomb. I backed away from the terminal, moving toward the shadows beneath a heavy steel workbench. The creature that entered the lab was the nightmare from the tank made manifest. It moved on all fours, but not like a dog, like a spider, limbs splayed at impossible angles, joints cracking softly with every movement. Its skin was the color of desert sand and concrete, perfect camouflage for the ruins above. It paused in the doorway, its head tilting. The bone-plated face was featureless save for the mouth and those pulsing slits along the neck. It let out a chittering hiss, tasting the air. It knew I was there. It didn't know exactly where, but it could smell the sweat, could feel the displacement of the air. It stalked forward, claws ticking against the linoleum floor. I raised my carbine, knowing the noise of a gunshot in this enclosed space would be deafening, and likely a dinner bell for the rest of the pack. I needed a distraction. My hand drifted to my belt, fingers brushing the cold aluminum of a road flare. The creature stopped 5 feet from my hiding spot. It reared up on its hind legs, sniffing. I could see the muscles tensing beneath the chitinous armor. It was preparing to pounce. I ripped the cap off the flare and struck the igniter. A blinding magnesium red light erupted, accompanied by a ferocious hiss. I tossed it across the room toward the shattered containment tubes. The creature shrieked, a sound that was half scream, half grinding metal, and lunged at the heat source. The flare confused its thermal sense, a sudden supernova in a dark room. I didn't wait to see if it attacked the flare. I sprinted. I scrambled over the workbench, boots slamming onto the floor, abandoning stealth for velocity. The creature roared behind me, the sound of glass shattering indicating it had realized its mistake. I hit the corridor, turning left back toward the airlock. Behind me, the clicking multiplied. 1 set of claws became 3, then 5. The pack was waking up. I could hear them skittering on the walls, on the ceiling. They were faster than the surface shamblers, agile and driven by a predatory intelligence. I reached the quartermaster's storage. Swinging the heavy door shut and spinning the locking wheel just as a heavy body slammed into the metal from the other side. The impact shook dust from the ceiling. I was trapped, but I was armed, and I had supplies. I backed away from the door, watching the wheel twitch as something outside tested it. I looked down at the tactical vest I had scavenged, the water filters, the ammo. I had come down here looking for resources to survive the dead world above, thinking the isolation of the bunker was safety. I was wrong. The bunker wasn't a shelter, it was a cocoon. The virus hadn't just destroyed humanity. It was building something to replace us, something designed to inherit the burning world. I checked my magazine. 28 rounds. Outside, the scratching grew louder, a rhythmic scraping of bone against steel. I sat on a crate of MREs and waited. I had found the supplies I needed, but I had also found the truth. And right now, the truth was trying to chew through 3 inches of reinforced steel. The hydraulic hiss of the airlock unsealing was the loudest sound I had heard in months. A violent expulsion of pressurized stasis that cut through the silence of the dune sea like a scream. I didn't wait for the dust to settle before I shoved the heavy steel door inward. The air that rushed out to meet me wasn't just stale. It was ancient, tasting of copper, ozone, and the distinct, cloying sweetness of rot that had been hermetically sealed for God knows how long. I pulled my rebreather tight against my face, the rubber seal biting into my sunburned skin, and clicked on the rail-mounted light of my carbine. The beam cut a cone of illuminated dust through the gloom, landing first on a security desk that had been overturned, and then on the floor, which was carpeted in a layer of brass casings. It had been a last stand. That much was obvious. But there were no bodies. That was the first red flag. Usually, a kill zone like this is littered with the gnawed bones of the fallen, or the desiccated husks of the infected who starved waiting for fresh meat. Here, the floor was clean of corpses, save for the dark, flaking stains of old blood that mapped out the drag marks leading deeper into the subterranean dark. I stepped over the threshold, the temperature dropping 20 degrees in a single stride, leaving the scorching desert sun behind for the artificial chill of the grave. My priority was water, then munitions, then answers, strictly in that order. I swept the security checkpoint, my gloved hands moving with the practiced efficiency of a carrion bird. The guards' lockers had been rifled through, but whoever looted this place had been in a panic. They missed the small things. Under a tossed bench, I found a sealed filtered canteen and a box of 5.56 rounds kicking around loose in the dust. I loaded the rounds into my spare mag, the metallic snick 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 echoing uncomfortably loud in the concrete throat of the bunker. I moved past the blast doors, descending a spiral metal staircase that groaned under my weight. The air grew heavier the deeper I went, thick with a metallic tang that made the hairs on my arms stand up. This wasn't just a military outpost. The signage on the walls, peeling and yellowed, indicated a research facility. Sublevel 3. Biological containment. Just my luck. I wasn't looking for a cure anymore. Hope is a calorie waster in the wasteland, but labs usually meant emergency rations and medical-grade stimulants. I reached the bottom landing and found the corridor blocked by a makeshift barricade of filing cabinets and lab tables. I climbed over, my flashlight sweeping the darkness. That's when I saw the first one. It wasn't shambling. It wasn't even humanoid anymore, not strictly. The corpse was fused to the wall, not by straps or chains, but by a calcified gray resin that seemed to have erupted from its own pores. This was the evolution. The surface walkers, the ones baking in the sun, they were the simpletons, the degrading remnants of the initial outbreak. Down here, in the dark and the cool, the pathogen had time. It had stability. It had mutated. I leaned in closer, the beam of my light playing over the creature's skin. It looked like armor. Chitinous plates had overgrown the soft tissue, turning the chest cavity into a rigid, bone-like cage. The fingers had fused into singular, hooked spikes. This wasn't a zombie. This was a biological weapon forged in the incubator of the underground. I backed away, gripping my rifle tighter. If this thing had died while transforming, what happened to the ones that finished the process? I pressed on, my boots crunching on broken glass. I found the cafeteria, usually a goldmine for scavengers. The vending machines were smashed, but the pantry door was locked. A quick pry with my crowbar popped the latch. Jackanapes. Shelf-stable peaches, freeze-dried beef stroganoff, and crates of bottled water. I shoved what I could into my rucksack, the weight comforting, but my eyes kept darting to the shadows. I needed to understand what I was dealing with before I bedded down here. I moved to the adjacent room, a server farm with a terminal blinking with a low-power warning. I wiped the dust from the screen. A fragmentation of logs remained accessible. I scrolled through the entries, the timestamps dating back 3 years. Subject Delta shows resistance to small arms fire. The dermal hardening is accelerating in the absence of UV radiation. They are hive-minded now. They don't hunt by sight, they hunt by vibration. I stopped reading. Vibration. The groan of the airlock door. The clatter of the ammo. The crunch of the glass. I had been ringing the dinner bell since I arrived. I froze, holding my breath, straining my ears against the hum of the ventilation. Then I heard it. A clicking sound. Like two stones being struck together, rhythmic and purposeful. It was coming from the ventilation shaft above me. Asterisk click. 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 Asterisk, it wasn't the mindless moan of the dead. It was echolocation. I slowly raised my rifle, aiming at the grate in the ceiling. The metal bowed downward. The clicking stopped. Silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. Then, the grate exploded outward. A gray blur dropped to the floor with the weight of an anvil. It unfolded, standing a head taller than me, its skin a topography of jagged bone plates and gray muscle. It had no eyes, just a smooth, armored dome where the face should be, and a mouth full of needle teeth that split the jaw down to the neck. It tilted its head, listening. I didn't hesitate. I squeezed the trigger. The muzzle flash illuminated the room in strobe light terror. The bullet sparked off its chest, ricocheting wildly. Standard center mass shots were useless. It roared, a sound like grinding metal, and lunged. I threw myself to the side, rolling over a desk as the creature smashed the furniture into splinters. It was fast. Too fast for something that heavy. I scrambled back, my mind racing. Asterisk joints. Eyes. Soft tissue. Asterisk it had none. I needed high caliber or explosives, and I was fresh out of grenades. The creature turned, the head snapping toward the sound of my boots scuffing the linoleum. It charged again. I fired at its legs, hoping to break the bone beneath the armor. A round found purchase in the knee joint, blowing out a chunk of dark, viscous fluid. It stumbled, crashing into a server rack. I didn't wait to see if it would get up. I sprinted for the door, the adrenaline dumping into my system so hard my vision blurred. I could hear it scrambling behind me, claws gouging deep furrows into the concrete floor. I vaulted back over the barricade in the hallway, the creature impacting the filing cabinets with the force of a freight train a second later. I made it to the spiral stairs, taking them two at a time, my lungs burning, the weight of the scavenged food dragging me down. The clicking was behind me again, rapid and angry. It was climbing the walls of the stairwell. I reached the top, the circle of daylight from the open airlock shining like salvation. I scrambled through the blast doors and spun around, slamming the emergency override button. The heavy hydraulics whined, the massive steel slab beginning to slide shut. The creature crested the stairs, a nightmare of gray bone and teeth. It leaped, clearing the distance in a single bound, but the door was faster. With a sickening crunch, the blast door slammed home, catching the creature's arm. It shrieked, a sound that vibrated in my teeth, before the limb was sheared off completely, falling to the floor at my feet. The severed arm twitched, the claw scratching uselessly at the metal. I backed away, out into the blinding desert sun, gasping for air. The heat hit me like a physical blow, but I welcomed it. The logs said the hardening accelerated in the absence of UV. The sun was the only thing keeping them down there. I looked at the bunker entrance, then at the severed, armored claw twitching in the dust. The infection hadn't just survived the apocalypse, it had adapted to conquer it. And I had just opened the front door. The rusted wheel of the airlock burned my palm, scorching the leather of my gloves even through the thick material. The Nevada sun was a physical weight, a hammer beating against the back of my neck, urging me to die or find shelter. This wasn't just shelter. The schematics I'd pulled off a dead corporal outside Vegas suggested this was a localized command node, untouched since the fall. I jammed the crowbar into the wheel's spokes and heaved. For a moment, nothing happened, just the groaning of metal fusing with time, and then, with a screech that echoed across the silent dunes, the seal broke. A hiss of pressurized air, stale and tasting of copper, vented out, smelling of a world that died 20 years ago. I slid into the darkness, pulling the heavy slab shut above me. The silence was immediate. The howling wind of the desert was replaced by the hum of my own blood in my ears and the rhythmic click of my Geiger counter. It hovered in the safe zone, but barely. I clicked on my shoulder lamp. The beam cut through dust motes that had been suspended in stasis for 2 decades. The hallway was pristine, sterile white tiles now coated in a fine layer of gray silt. This was a Tier 1 facility. That meant loot. High-grade loot. My boots crunched over broken glass as I approached the security checkpoint. The guards were still there. Or what was left of them. They weren't the shamblers I was used to up on the surface, dried-out husks stumbling mindlessly towards sound. These bodies were slumped in chairs, mummified by the filtered air. I checked the first one's tactical vest. Jackpot. 3 magazines of 5. 56, standard NATO issue, the brass barely tarnished. I racked the slide on my own cobbled-together carbine and swapped a fresh mag in. But it was the pouch on the guard's belt that made my heart race, a sealed auto-injector case. Epinephrine. Morphine. Broad-spectrum antibiotics. In the ruins of Phoenix, a single dose of amoxicillin could buy you a working truck. I had 5. I pushed deeper, moving past the administrative sector into the labs. The air grew colder, heavy with a chemical tang that bypassed my respirator filters. This is where the money was. I wasn't just looking for ammo. I needed filters, batteries, and tech. I began rifling through lockers. I found a treasure trove of lithium-ion cells, still holding a partial charge, and a portable water filtration pump with spare ceramic cores. I shoved them into my pack, the weight comforting. But as I swept the beam across the lab benches, I stopped. The room was lined with containment tubes. Most were shattered, the glass covering the floor like jagged ice. But 3 were intact. I wiped the dust from the first cylinder and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the bunker's temperature. The thing floating in the amber suspension fluid wasn't human. Not anymore. It was a chaotic evolution of the viral strain we knew. The surface infected were necrotic. They rotted. This thing had armored itself. I moved to the terminal next to the tubes. The backup power was dead, but my wrist comp had a bypass leech. I hooked it up, praying the capacitors had enough juice to spin the hard drive. Green text flickered on the CRT monitor. Log date, year 2 of the fall. Subject 814 shows hypercalcification of the dermis. The virus is reacting to the arid climate simulations. It's not just reanimating the host, it's fortifying it. The necrosis has stopped, replaced by a fungal-like hardening of the tissue. It's creating a carapace. Small arms fire is ineffective against the chest and cranial plates. We are calling it the armadillo variant. Note: extreme photosensitivity. They go dormant in UV light, but their metabolic rate triples in darkness. Triples in darkness. I froze. I looked back at the shattered tubes. There were 12 mounts. 3 were intact. 9 were broken. The glass was pushed outward, not inward. They hadn't been broken by looters. They had broken out. A sound dry and clicking, like 2 stones being rubbed together, drifted from the ventilation duct above me. I killed my shoulder light instantly. Total darkness engulfed the lab, save for the faint green glow of the terminal screen. I held my breath, my grip tightening on my rifle until my knuckles popped. The clicking grew louder. It wasn't footsteps, it was claws on metal. I switched to thermal vision on my monocle. The room was a wash of cool blues, dead and cold. Then I saw it. Clinging to the ceiling pipes, a heat signature burning bright red and orange. It didn't look like a man. It looked like a gargoyle of fused bone and muscle. The infection had sealed its eyes shut, relying entirely on sound and thermal reception. It was hunting. I needed to move. The exit to the stairwell was 30 feet away. I grabbed a glass beaker from the desk and hurled it into the far corner of the room. It shattered. The reaction was instantaneous. The creature detached from the ceiling, dropping with a heavy, metallic thud. It moved with terrifying speed, a skittering blur of hardened limbs rushing toward the noise. I sprinted. My boots slammed against the tile. I didn't care about noise now. I cared about distance. I hit the stairwell door and shoved it open, the hinges screaming. Behind me, a guttural shriek erupted, a sound of wet tearing meat. I risked a glance back. The creature had realized the deception. It was charging, its movements jerky but incredibly fast. I raised my rifle and fired 3 rounds. Asterisk ping. Ping. Thud. Asterisk. The first 2 shots sparked off its chest plate like they'd hit a tank. The third caught it in the shoulder, spinning it slightly but not slowing it down. The terminal was right. Standard ballistics were useless against the plating. I needed to break the armor or hit the joints. I scrambled up the stairs, my lungs burning. I could hear it scrabbling up the railing below me, bypassing the steps entirely. Level 2. Maintenance. I burst through the door and scanned the room frantically. Pipes. Valves. Chemical storage. My eyes landed on a yellow cabinet marked flammable. I didn't have grenades. I didn't have C4. I had scavenged alcohol and a flare. The door behind me buckled. The creature was ramming it. The steel warped, the paint flaking off as the calcified bone hammered against it. I ripped the cap off a bottle of industrial acetone I'd swiped from the lab and jammed a strip of cloth into it. The door hinges popped. The creature squeezed through the gap, its jaw unhinging to reveal rows of needle teeth. It hissed, the sound vibrating in my chest. I struck the flare. The red magnesium light sizzled, blinding in the gloom. The creature recoiled, screeching at the sudden UV exposure, covering its face with its armored forearms. Photosensitivity, I whispered. I threw the bottle at its feet and tossed the flare. The explosion wasn't Hollywood. It was a sudden, violent consumption of oxygen. The blue flame engulfed the creature. It thrashed, the heat evidently penetrating the armor where bullets couldn't. The fire consumed the oxygen in the small room instantly, sucking the air from my lungs, but the creature was shrieking, flailing, smashing into the shelves. I didn't wait to watch it burn. I ran. I vaulted over the railing of the maintenance catwalk and hit the ground floor hard, rolling to absorb the impact. My ankle flared with pain, but the adrenaline masked it. I sprinted for the airlock, the sounds of the dying beast echoing through the ventilation shafts. It wasn't dead, I knew that. The fire would only slow it down. The evolution of the virus meant it could likely survive extreme trauma, regenerate, and adapt again. I reached the heavy blast door and spun the wheel, my arms trembling. It groaned open. Sunlight, beautiful, blinding, searing sunlight, poured in. I tumbled out onto the sand, gasping for air, the heat of the desert instantly drying the cold sweat on my skin. I lay there for a moment, clutching my pack. I had the antibiotics. I had the ammo. I had the water filters. But as I looked back at the dark maw of the bunker entrance, I knew the intel was worth more than the loot. The infection was changing. The desert wasn't killing them, it was forging them into weapons. We thought we were waiting them out, that they would rot away and leave the world to us. We were wrong. They were just getting started. The hydraulic hiss of the blast door was the loudest sound I had heard in 6 months. It cut through the howling wind of the wasteland like a gunshot, signaling the breach of a seal that had held for a decade. As the rusted steel wheel finally gave way to the leverage of my crowbar, the heavy door groaned inward. Exhaling a breath of air that smelled of copper, ozone, and ancient, stagnant dust. I slipped through the gap, my boots transitioning from the scorching, bleached sand of the desert ruins to the cold, industrial grating of the airlock. The silence inside was absolute, a heavy blanket that pressed against my eardrums, instantly dampening the relentless roar of the sandstorm outside. I clicked on my shoulder-mounted flashlight, the beam cutting a sharp cone through the gloom, illuminating walls lined with conduit pipes and warning hazards that had long since peeled away. My first priority was security. My second was loot. The airlocks cycled manually, the gears grinding with the protest of neglected lubrication. Once the inner door was secured, trapping the silence with me, I checked my Geiger counter. The needle barely twitched. Good. No radiation leaks, which meant the reactor was either dead or in sleep mode. I moved deeper, my rifle raised, the stock pressed tight against my shoulder. The layout was standard military subterranean, brutalist concrete, harsh angles, and checkpoints designed to function as kill zones. The first checkpoint was a graveyard, but not the kind I was used to. On the surface, the infected, the shamblers, were desiccated things, dried out by the sun until their skin was like jerky. Their movements jerky and brittle. Down here, in the dark and the damp, the infection had taken a different, more horrifying path. I found the first corpse slumped over a security console. It wasn't rotting. It was blooming. A network of gray, fibrous tendrils had erupted from the victim's pores, anchoring the body to the metal desk. The skin had turned a translucent, waxen gray, and the eyes were gone, replaced by clusters of bioluminescent nodes that pulsed with a faint, rhythmic light. This was the evolution the surface survivors whispered about but had never seen, the weave. Without UV radiation to burn it away, the virus didn't just animate the host, it transformed them into a cultivation medium. I stepped closer, careful not to touch the biomass. The console flickering beneath the corpse's fused hand showed a security log frozen 10 years ago. I carefully pried a keycard from the corpse's belt, the fibrous webbing snapping with a wet, tearing sound that made my stomach churn. I didn't linger. If this thing was part of a network, I didn't want to wake the neighbors. I pushed into the logistics sector, the beam of my light sweeping over rows of metal shelving. This was the jackpot. The scavenging phase began with a desperate, methodical hunger. I bypassed the clothing and bedding, too much risk of contamination, and went straight for the sealed crates. My pry bar made short work of a plastic transport bin. Inside, MREs, the brown packaging coated in dust but intact. Menu 4, pork with rice and barbecue sauce. I almost wept. I shoved 6 of them into my pack, the weight of the calories reassuring against my spine. Next to the food were water filtration tablets, and more importantly, replacement filters for a standard issue gas mask. I swapped mine out immediately, the stale air of the bunker suddenly tasting sharper, cleaner. But the real prize was in the armory cage at the back of the sector. The lock had been shot out years ago, likely by the guards during the initial fall. Inside the cage, the racks were picked clean of rifles, but the floor was littered with ammo cans. I knelt, cracking one open. The rubber seal popped. 5 56mm rounds, green-tipped, brass shining like gold in the flashlight beam. I loaded 3 magazines, the mechanical click of the springs the only comfort in the dark. It was then that I noticed the walls of the armory. They weren't concrete anymore. The gray weave had covered them, pulsating gently. Embedded in the wall texture were faces, human faces, stretched and flattened, assimilated into the structure of the room. They were dormant, their mouths sealed shut by the fungal growth. I froze. The vibration of my boots on the grating seemed deafening now. The infection down here wasn't just about aggression, it was about efficiency. These things were hibernating, merging with the architecture to conserve energy until fresh meat arrived. I backed out slowly, my heart hammering against my ribs. I needed to get to the lower levels, to the medical bay, to see if there were antibiotics, but the architecture of the infection was getting denser. As I descended the stairwell to level 3, the air grew thick and humid. The temperature rose slightly, generated by the heat of thousands of biological processes. The stairwell opened into a central atrium, and my light revealed the nightmare. The entire center of the room was a hive. Bodies were fused together in a spiraling column that reached the ceiling, a totem of twisted limbs and fused torsos. And they were shifting. The light from my torch provoked a reaction. The bioluminescent nodes on the column flared from a dull blue to an angry crimson. I killed the light instantly, plunging myself into darkness, relying on the ambient, sickly glow of the infected column. A sound echoed through the atrium, a wet, clicking noise, like wet leather being stretched. They were waking up. I crouched behind a concrete planter, checking the action on my rifle. The evolution here had created a hive mind. The vibration of the blast door opening miles above must have sent a tremor through the structure, a dinner bell ringing in the deep. I saw movement near the base of the column. One of the sentinels detached itself. It didn't shamble. It moved on all fours, its limbs elongated and joints reversed, specialized for skittering across walls and ceilings. It had no eyes, just a massive sensory organ in the center of its face that twitched, tasting the air. I needed a distraction. I pulled a flare from my belt, cracked the cap, and tossed it toward the far hallway. The magnesium hissed and sputtered, casting harsh red shadows. The sentinel shrieked, a sound barely human, and lunged toward the light, its claws striking sparks off the floor. I moved. I sprinted toward the medical bay doors, staying low. The hive erupted. The column of bodies began to untangle, dozens of them tearing free from the biomass with sickening squelches. I hit the door mechanism. It was jammed. I slammed the butt of my rifle against the manual override, pumping the handle. Behind me, the skittering grew louder, a tide of wet slaps against the tile floor. The door gave way, sliding open just enough for me to squeeze through. I tumbled inside and jammed the crowbar through the handles just as a heavy body slammed into the glass porthole. The glass cracked but held. I scrambled back, raising my weapon, but the creature didn't try to break in. It pressed its face against the glass. I saw the evolution clearly now. The mouth was a circular maw of needle teeth, designed to grind bone. It hissed, a spray of spores coating the glass, then retreated into the darkness. I was trapped in the medbay, but I was alive. I turned to scan the room. It was pristine. Surgical tools, sealed vials, a trauma kit. And on the central table, a corpse in a lab coat holding a datapad. I picked it up, the battery miraculously holding a sliver of charge. The last entry was typed, not dictated. Subject 84 has shown ability to metabolize steel and concrete. The containment is failing. The virus is rewriting their DNA to survive the starvation. They aren't dying. They are becoming the bunker. I looked at the walls of the medbay. In the corner, the paint was bubbling, the gray fibers just beginning to poke through. I wasn't just in a bunker. I was inside the stomach of a living organism that was slowly waking up. I grabbed the trauma kit, shoved a handful of painkillers and antibiotics into my rig, and looked at the ventilation shaft above the operating table. It was small, tight, and dark. But it was the only way out that didn't lead back to the hive. I holstered my rifle, pulled out my knife, and climbed up onto the table. The scavenging was done. Now, the escape began. The heavy steel wheel of the airlock turned with a scream of rusted metal that echoed like a gunshot in the vacuum of the desert silence. For a moment, I paused, listening for the telltale hiss of hydraulics or the groan of automated systems, but the bunker was dead. Dead as the dried-up corpses littering the dunes above. I pushed the heavy door inward, the seal breaking with a sharp pop of pressure equalization. The blast of air that hit me wasn't the stagnant rot I expected. It was sterile, chemically cold, and smelled faintly of ozone and old copper. I slipped inside, sealing the scorching Mojave heat behind me, and clicked on my tactical light. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating a suspended dust motes that had likely been floating there undisturbed for a decade. The initial vestibule was a decontamination chamber. Yellow hazmat suits hung limp on the walls like shed skins of giant insects. I bypassed the shower protocols. There was no water pressure anyway, and moved toward the inner blast doors. They were jammed open, a heavy steel crate of ammunition wedged into the track to keep them from sealing. That was the first sign that this place hadn't fallen to a surprise attack. It had been abandoned, or worse, someone had tried to escape and failed. I checked my weapon, a battered AR-15 with a magazine that was running dangerously low. Scavenging wasn't just a necessity anymore. It was the only religion left. I needed 56 rounds, water filters, and antibiotics. In that order. The main corridor stretched out into the dark, the floor tiles cracked and stained with something dark and ancient. I kept my back to the wall, sweeping the light across the doorways. Dormitory A, cafeteria, armory. My heart skipped a beat at the last sign. I moved to the armory door, but the electronic lock was dead. I fished a crowbar from my pack, jamming it into the seam. With a grunt of exertion that felt too loud in the silence, I popped the door. The shelves were mostly bare, stripped by the previous occupants, but in the corner, beneath a fallen locker, I saw the glint of brass. I shimmied under the debris. 2 boxes of military-grade rounds and a pristine combat knife. I loaded the rounds into my magazines with trembling fingers, the metallic click-click-click the only sound in the buried world. It was a small victory, but out here, small victories bought you another day of breathing. Deeper in. Level 2. The air grew colder here, and the smell changed. It wasn't sterile anymore. It smelled like wet earth and spoiled meat. This level was marked research and pathology. The looting urge battled with my survival instinct. Research labs meant medical supplies, maybe even morphine, but they also meant the source of the infection. I pushed through a set of double doors into a lab that looked like a hurricane had hit it. Centrifuges smashed on the floor, glass shards everywhere, papers strewn like confetti. I picked up a clipboard from a desk. The date was 3 years after the initial outbreak. They had survived here a long time. The log entries were erratic, written in a hand that deteriorated from neat cursive to jagged, frantic scrawls. Subject 14 shows signs of carapace development, one entry read. The virus isn't just reanimating necrotic tissue anymore. It's adapting to the environmental stressors. The heat of the surface is forcing a biological callus. Calcification of the dermis. I frowned, tucking the log into my pack. Evolution. We always thought the ZS were a static enemy, rotting clocks counting down to 0. But nature hates a vacuum, and the virus was filling the void left by humanity. If they were evolving armor, my 56 rounds might as well be spitballs. I found the cold storage at the back of the lab. The generator backup must have failed years ago. The doors were unlocked. Inside, the smell hit me like a physical blow, a concentrated wall of putrescence. But it wasn't just the smell of death, it was the smell of a hive. I swept my light over the gurneys. The bodies strapped to them were wrong. They weren't just decayed. Their skin had hardened into gray, rocky plates. Bone spurs protruded from their elbows and shoulders, sharpened by some agonizing biological process. They looked less like people and more like organic tanks. I stepped closer to one, fascinated and horrified. The bone plating covered the chest and the skull, leaving only the jaw and the eyes exposed. A natural helmet. Suddenly, the silence broke. A wet, clicking sound came from the ventilation duct above me. Not the shuffle of a walker, but the rhythmic tapping of something hard against metal. I killed my light instantly, plunging the room into absolute pitch. I held my breath, my pulse hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The vent grate squealed, metal shearing against metal. Something dropped to the floor with a heavy, solid thud. It didn't stumble. It landed and stabilized immediately. I listened. The breathing was ragged, wet but deep. This wasn't a mindless ghoul gasping for air it didn't need. This thing was hunting. I realized with a jolt of terror that the evolution logs weren't just talking about armor. They were talking about sensory adaptation. In the dark of the bunker, they didn't need eyes. They used sound. I reached for a beaker on the counter beside me, my fingers brushing the glass. I tossed it across the room. It shattered. The reaction was instantaneous. The creature shrieked, a sound like grinding gears, and charged the noise. I flicked my light back on, blinding myself for a split second before the beam found the target. It was a nightmare of calcified flesh. Standing 7 feet tall, its skin was a mosaic of gray bone plates. It had smashed into the far counter, shredding the steel with claws that looked like obsidian knives. It turned its head toward the light, the milky white cataracts of its eyes useless, but its nostrils flared. It roared and lunged at me. I squeezed the trigger. The rifle barked, the muzzle flash illuminating the horror in strobing bursts. The round sparked off its chest, ricocheting harmlessly against the bone armor. It didn't even slow down. I scrambled back, slipping on the slick floor tiles, barely dodging a swipe that would have taken my head off. The claw gouged a 3-inch deep trench in the concrete wall. I rolled, aiming for the legs, but the knees were plated too. Think! I screamed internally. Soft spots. The jaw. The neck was thick with muscle, but the jaw had to open to bite. As it turned to face me again, gathering itself for a spring, I switched to semi-auto. I needed precision, not spray. It leaped. I dropped to my back, sliding between the lab tables, and fired upward. 1, 2, 3 shots. The first 2 pinged off its chin, but the third went into the open mouth, punching through the soft palate and into the brain stem. The creature convulsed in midair, crashing down on top of me. The weight was crushing, like a fallen statue. I gasped, the wind knocked out of me, struggling to push the massive, reeking carcass off my legs. Black ichor dripped from its mouth onto my vest, sizzling slightly as it hit the fabric. Acidic blood. Another adaptation. I kicked free, scrambling backward, panting, checking myself for bites or scratches. Nothing. Just bruises. I stood up, shaking, keeping the light trained on the corpse. It was dead, truly dead this time. I walked over to it, nudging the armored shoulder with my boot. The plating was as hard as ceramic. This was the future of the infection. The desert surface killed the weak ones, dried them out, but the ones that found shelter, the ones that found the bunkers. They were becoming apex predators. I looked around the lab again. The scavenging trip had yielded ammo and a knife, but the knowledge I'd found was far heavier. I wasn't just surviving against the dead anymore. I was fighting a new species. I grabbed a backpack from a hooks on the wall, an old medic's bag, and swept the remaining intact medical supplies into it. Bandages, a bottle of isopropyl alcohol, a sealed box of surgical tools. I didn't linger. The noise of the gunshot would travel through the ventilation shafts. If there was one of them, there were more. I made my way back to the stairs, moving faster now, reckless with the noise. I needed the heat. I needed the sun. The bunker wasn't a sanctuary, it was an incubator. As I climbed the ladder back to the airlock, I heard the distant, echoing screech of metal on metal from the lower levels. A chorus of them. They were waking up. I spun the wheel of the hatch, the blistering sunlight blinding me as I scrambled out onto the sand. I slammed the wheel shut, spinning it until my muscles burned, sealing the tomb once more. I collapsed on the hot sand, the dry air scorching my lungs, staring at the rusted metal hatch. I had supplies, I had ammo, but as I looked out at the shimmering horizon of the ruins, I knew the rules had changed. The bunker was a warning. The world wasn't healing, it was hardening, and if I wanted to live, I had to do the same. The wheel of the blast door was cold enough to burn my palms, a jarring contrast to the blistering Nevada heat shimmering off the sand above. I leaned my full weight into it, the iron groaning in a low, harmonic protest that vibrated through my bones. Decades, maybe longer, since this seal had been broken. With a final, piercing shriek of rusted hydraulics, the seal gave way. A hiss of escaping air, stale, pressurized, smelling of ozone and dead electricity, blasted past me, kicking up a vortex of sand. I clicked my flashlight on, the beam cutting a chaotic path through the dust motes, and descended into the throat of the earth. The silence down here was heavy, a physical weight pressing against my eardrums. It wasn't the natural quiet of the desert, it was the manufactured silence of a tomb. The air grew cooler with every rung of the ladder I descended, the temperature dropping until my sweat-soaked shirt turned clammy and cold against my skin. My boots hit the grate of the decontamination chamber with a metallic clang that sounded like a gunshot in a library. I froze, weapon raised, breath held. Nothing. No skittering, no moans, no shambling footsteps. Just the rhythmic drip of condensation somewhere deep in the dark. I bypassed the decontamination showers. No power meant no chemical scrubbing, and pried open the secondary doors. The beam of my light swept across a reception area that looked like it had been frozen in time. Papers were scattered across the floor, yellowed and curling, but there was no blood. That was the first red flag. Usually, these places are slaughterhouses, the last stand of the desperate. This was orderly. Too orderly. It implied that whatever happened here didn't involve a panic. It involved surrender, or something instantaneous. My priority was supplies. My water filter was running on its last charcoal block, and I had 3 rounds left in the chamber of my rifle. I moved deeper, clearing rooms with methodical paranoia. The signage on the walls was military-grade stencil, mess hall, barracks, secure research. I headed for the mess hall first. The shelves were stripped bare of the easy stuff, but the scavengers before me had been lazy or hurried. They'd missed the crawl spaces and the locked lockers. I used the pry bar on a reinforced pantry locker, the metal screeching in the dark. Jackpot. Freeze-dried strawberries, MREs that expired 10 years ago but were still edible, and miraculously, a crate of bottled water. I cracked one open, the seal snapping, and downed it. It tasted like plastic and dust, the best thing I'd ever had. But survival isn't just about calories, it's about intel. I needed to know why this place was sealed from the inside. I moved toward the secure research wing. The atmosphere changed here. The air was thicker, carrying a metallic tang, like copper pennies and bleach. The doors here were heavy glass, reinforced with wire mesh. Most were shattered. I stepped into the main lab, my boots crunching on glass. That's when I saw the evolution. The narrative of the infection we had been told on the surface, that the virus was a rotting agent, a necrotic driver, was wrong. Or at least, incomplete. On the exam tables, the bodies weren't rotting. They were calcifying. I approached the nearest corpse. It was a man in a lab coat, but his skin had turned a slate gray, hard as stone to the touch. I tapped it with the barrel of my rifle. It made a sound like striking ceramic. The virus hadn't just killed him, it had armored him. I shone the light on the whiteboard behind the corpse. Frantic scribbles in red marker detailed the mutation, strain delta. Subdermal ossification. Subject 4 displays resistance to small arms fire. The pathogen is adapting to ballistics. It is learning warfare. A chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning ran down my spine. We thought the zombies were decaying, that time was on our side, that eventually, they would rot into slush. But down here, in the dark, the virus had engineered a soldier. These weren't the shambling dead, these were statues of war. I moved to a workstation, looking for ammunition. I found a heavy pistol, .45 caliber, gripped tightly in the hand of a severed arm. I pried the fingers loose, they snapped like dry twigs, and checked the mag full. I pocketed it. As I turned, my light swept over a containment cylinder in the corner. It was shattered from the inside out. A sound scraped against the silence. Not a moan. A grinding noise. Like tectonic plates shifting. I spun around. The statue on the table was gone. Panic, cold and sharp, flooded my system. I scanned the room, the flashlight beam jerking erratically. Nothing but shadows and equipment. Then I heard the sound again, coming from the ceiling. I looked up just as the gray mass detached itself from the ventilation duct. It hit the floor with the weight of a boulder, cracking the tile. It was the doctor, but twisted. His jaw had fused shut, his fingers elongated into bone spikes. He didn't look at me. His eyes were covered by a layer of callous skin. He was blind. But as I shifted my weight, his head snapped toward the sound. Echolocation. Or tremor sense. He lunged. It wasn't the clumsy stumble of a surface walker. It was a powered, hydraulic burst of speed. I threw myself to the right, rolling over a desk as his bone-fused fist pulverized the laminate where my chest had been a second ago. I brought the rifle up, firing my last 3 rounds into his center mass. Asterisk bang. 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 Asterisk. Sparks flew. The bullets didn't penetrate. They ricocheted off his calcified chest plate, whining into the dark. He didn't even flinch. He roared, a sound like grinding gravel, and swiped the desk aside as if it were made of cardboard. I scrambled back, dropping the empty rifle. I drew the .45 I'd just scavenged. The whiteboard said they were adapting to ballistics, but physics is physics. If I couldn't pierce the armor, I had to break the structure. I aimed for the joints. The thing charged again. I waited, heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. 10 feet. 5 feet. I fired. The heavy slug hit his right knee. The calcified plating cracked, and the leg buckled. He went down hard, sliding across the floor, claws gouging deep furrows in the concrete. He wasn't dead. He was crawling now, dragging that shattered leg, the grinding noise deafening. I didn't wait to see if he could heal. I sprinted for the door, slamming the heavy glass shut and jamming the pry bar through the handles just as he slammed into it. The glass spiderwebbed, white cracks blooming outward, but it held. For now. I backed away, chest heaving. Through the crazed glass, I saw him standing up, the bone knitting together with sickening speed. The infection wasn't just hardening them, it was fixing them. I retreated to the lower levels, looking for a secondary exit. The elevator shaft was my only bet. I forced the doors open and looked down. The cables were cut, dangling into the abyss. But there was a maintenance ladder. I climbed, the metal cold and slick with grease. As I ascended, I passed other levels. Through the grates I saw them. Rows and rows of them. Hundreds of calcified figures standing in the dark, motionless, waiting. A terracotta army of the infected. They were dormant now, but I knew what woke them. Sound. Vibration. The bunker wasn't a shelter. It was a silo. And I had just rung the dinner bell. I reached the surface access hatch, my muscles screaming, lungs burning. I spun the wheel, pushing up into the blinding white of the desert afternoon. The heat hit me like a physical blow, but it felt like a blessing compared to the cold tomb below. I scrambled out, sealing the hatch behind me and piling rocks over it, camouflaging the entry. I sat there for a long time, watching the heat waves dance off the sand. I looked at the .45 in my hand, then at the vast, empty horizon. The scavenged water and food in my pack felt heavy, but the knowledge I carried was heavier. The surface walkers were dying out, rotting away. But beneath us, in the dark, something stronger was growing. The infection was evolving. It was armoring up for the next phase of the war. And I was the only one who knew that the ground beneath our feet was ticking.